Okay, thank you very much, Piyush, for the introduction. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my workshop on the Wirral Peninsula. My name's John, and as introduced, I make boxes. So the plan for today's session is to introduce you a little bit to what I do, talk about some of my boxes, talk a little bit about my background, talk about the materials of timber, because everyone always wants to know a workshop on the Wirral Peninsula. My name's John, and yep, okay. To explain where I get my timber from, because everyone always wants to know, where do you get your timber? I'll also then be walking through a little demonstration of how I make one of my designs of boxes. So as a quick introduction to myself then, so I am, well, I make boxes obviously, but I've not been doing this forever. I actually studied woodworking at school when I was doing my GCSEs and my A-levels, and that's the last formal qualification in woodworking I ever got. And everything since then has been self-taught. So I actually left school and pursued a career in the corporate world, so in supply chain management, and I did that for approximately 15 years. The reason for switching careers partly was because we moved to where we are today, and it had this fabulous workshop. So I'd always had a passion for woodworking and for renovations, etc. So when we moved to our new house and it had this perfect workshop, it was an ideal opportunity. So I spent a couple of years making furniture, basically, so making kitchens, etc., for our holiday cottage that we have here. And once I'd finished all of that work, I realized I wanted to pursue this and carry on further. And that's how I ended up making boxes. There's obviously a practical benefit to making boxes instead of making furniture, is that actually I can keep my stock under the bed rather than having to have a massive warehouse to store it all in. So there's an element of practicality, and what you'll see when I show you around the workshop as well is that from a practical point of view, it's a very small workshop. So it's ideally sized for me. I'm quite a small person, and for the scale of work I do. So everything that is in here has basically been bought or engineered to the scale for making boxes. So it's kind of being customized in a way that allows me to do this rather than as a general kind of cabinetry or carpentry type workshop. So I switched to box making, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, and I've been doing it for professionally, I guess, for the last 5 years, along with the holiday cottage business that we run. I've been working with Handmade in Britain for a couple of years now through their Handmade Online. And that kind of brings us up to date. So this is what I do. If I'm going to talk through my boxes, but if people do have questions or they want to ask me anything, there is a chat box, so you can enter your questions on there, just put them in, and every now and then I will stop and I will ask Piyush if he wants to read out any of your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. So that's a little bit about me. I'm now going to just explain a few of my boxes, because I have essentially 3 or 4 standard design boxes which I make. And I'm going to start with this one at the front, so I'll just lift it up so you can see it a bit better. So I call these desk boxes. Basically, the reason why I call them that is they are empty inside, so they lend themselves to keeping bits and bobs in on your desk, so you can chuck your pens, pencils, etc. Obviously, you can do what you want with them, but I call them desk boxes. Now they are, they have a pivot hinge lid, which is slightly different to the others, which I'll explain. So the way the pivot hinge works is it's a single pin going through the lid that allows the lid to open and close. They are carved by hand, so that what you'll see hopefully is that the lid is actually contoured, so it has a shape carved into it, and similarly there, which provides you the finger hole. Now, these are basically carved out of a single piece of wood, with the sides made using traditional mortise and tenon joinery. This one in particular is made from horse chestnut, so it's the conker tree, basically. It's a UK timber, as are all of the timbers that I use. So I'll talk a little bit more about my timber and where it comes from and why I use UK timber. But this one is horse chestnut, And they're great fun to make. So people often ask, how long does it take you to make one of your boxes? Now, I really enjoy making this particular design or this style. They take...
Sorry, just to, can you bring the boxes closer to the camera so that people can see the detail? Right now, people can't see the detail that much.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So hopefully you can see that a bit better. So as I was saying, these are great fun boxes to make. They obviously, as you get better and quicker, but it takes a long day to make one from start to finish. Now, as I said, this is horse chestnut, and it's actually a burr horse chestnut. So all of these small islets, or they're sometimes called cat's paws, because as they span out, they look like cat's paws. It's just a wonderful timber to work with as well. So horse chestnut finishes really nicely. And as you start to use and work with different timbers, you'll realize that they all have different textures, and they work in different ways. So some timbers are incredibly smooth and soft and almost like velvet when you finish them, and they're also incredibly easy to shape and machine by hand. And others are the complete opposite, which is they always have a slightly open, rough grain, and they can be an absolute pain to work with. Sorry. So those are desk boxes. Now, obviously, shameless plug, these are sold, or I have some available on handmade online at the moment. Desk boxes typically start for a small one from £300, but they can then go up all the way to £500 as the timber used becomes more rare or exclusive, and also depending on the other techniques I've had to apply, which leads us on to the next type of box. So this is a more traditional design of box. So it's very much 6 sides, fairly rectangular. Now, what I do a lot, and with a lot of my timber, and how I try to utilize as much of the wood I buy as possible, is I've introduced resin casting. So what we can see, this dark gray streak running through. So my wife said it looks a bit like the opening scenes from EastEnders. That's not the intention, but there we go. It's actually made by casting resin between pieces of timber to allow me to retain the Wainy edges of the wood to create a single plank. And I'll be explaining that process in a little bit. So these are more, as I said, more traditional boxes. A couple of unique features which I like to do is the hinges are handmade as well. So I don't buy in metal hinges. I actually make my hinges from wood, which means when you open them, you get a creak. So, and the creaking is basically because the wooden knuckles are moving against each other. So this one's been laid out as a jewelry box. So it has removable trays and a storage area underneath. So again, that's your more traditional kind of design of box. And again, that one's on handmade in Britain. So as the boxes get bigger and bigger, and especially the more traditional design boxes, because the process to make them is so much longer, the price obviously starts to go up. So a kind of a jewelry box with a contemporary normal design or a standard design will start around £900 all the way up to £1,500, £1,800. I'm just going to talk very quickly about the big one. I'm just going to move this. So this is a similar idea to the way of making the box which it's currently resting on. So it's a fairly traditional rectangular box with sides, etc. And again, it's a resin casting technique. So what you can see, and I'll come round and show you in a little bit more detail, is that the timber has been cast in resin. Now this has a huge amount of resin. There's actually not a massive amount of timber, but you can see that the timber runs around, and again, the wooden hinges. Now this is actually a humidor, so it's designed for keeping your cigars in. So it's a slightly different technique to making it. Then you get the nice creak when you open the hinges. It's a little bit different from my normal boxes or a lot of the work I do in that it's not 100% British timber that I've used. So humidors are quite specific in the way they need to be built and to be used. It's actually lined and constructed using what's called Spanish cedar, or it's a type of mahogany basically. But the reason why that's used in a humidor is it's very, very stable when the humidity changes, and so changes in humidity between the inside and the outside. So humidors are quite a complex build process because you have to, create and combine the resin casting with the Wainy edge of the timber connected to a Spanish cedar lining, which then has a second lining inside to create an airtight seal on the lid. And then you have your humidification system. So I tend to use the electronic humidification systems because they're a lot easier to basically use. You set them, you fill them with water, and then you can forget about them. They don't require constant maintenance or checking, etc. Obviously, that will then keep the inside of the box at a constant 70% humidity, which is perfect for your cigars. Obviously, the outside of the box, it's a very different humidity, which is why it's so important to get to use Spanish cedar and to make sure it is dimensionally stable. Otherwise, you will end up with gaps and it will stop working. Now, so that's my one concession to non-British timbers is to use Spanish cedar in my humidors. Humidors are complex to build, and so they cost significantly more. So this one, for example, is £2,500, which is an investment if you are a particularly keen or avid cigar smoker and want to keep your cigars in the best possible condition. So that's the big one. Now,
Jonathan?
Yep.
So what's the favorite box you've ever made? Why is it your favorite box?
So my favorite box is actually, it's a desk box that was made out of horse chestnut, and similar to, for example, this box where it's got the resin casting in it, it had an aluminium resin casting. So, and it just fitted together perfectly with a beautiful kind of aluminium finish against the white chestnut, and it looked fantastic. And unfortunately, so I have it on, if you've ever seen me at the handmade events, I have a big poster in my booth and it's got a photo of my favorite box that I made on it. Sadly, I sold it and I wish I hadn't. I get to enjoy all of my boxes for a while, so they quite often, once they're finished, they will sit on our sideboard in our dining room to enjoy. But then when they go, that's the only one I've regretted selling, to be honest. I would have still kept that one forever, but such is life, maybe I will be able to make another one. So,
how long does it take to make one box approximately?
So the desk boxes take, I say, a long day. So it's probably a good 10-hour start to finish. So to go from a raw piece of timber to a finished box. Now, and everyone always asks the question of how long does it take to make them? Those are the only ones which I know I can do in a day. All the other boxes are, because their process has so many steps and there is such a lot of waiting time between each process, it's quite hard to say. But for the humidors, I actually just finished a recent commission of 4 humidors, and it took just over a month and a half to make 4 as a batch. So it can take quite a while, especially when you're using resin casting, because of the processes and the drying and curing times involved. So that brings me on to one of my last designs of boxes, and this is one I just started doing a couple of years ago, and people seem to really like it. So I'm going to come around and come a little bit closer. So this designer box, it's I call it a stacking trinket box, but it could be for your jewelry, etc. So it's a similar technique to that I've described, and I'm going to explain exactly how to make one of these shortly. But it's a similar technique of resin casting with encasing the timber. Now, they're stacking trinket boxes because as you take them off. So you end up with one layer, and then you can take off the second layer, and then finally the third layer. Now the idea behind them and why I wanted to make them was with a more traditional jewelry box where you have trays, you need to open it up, get your trays out, and you'll have things in the bottom. And with a stacking box, I thought it would be nice to be able to lay each of the trays out and maybe able to have them all visible at the same time without having to open, take individual trays out, put them back in. As I said, they seem to be quite popular as well, which is nice. And again, it's quite a fun build. And as I go through the steps, what you'll hopefully see is that the techniques and the steps involved in making something like this are exactly the same and applicable to the larger boxes with hinges. It's just different ways of using those techniques as you go through. So these stacking trinket boxes, this one's a burr oak with, it's aluminium. So it's actually quite heavy because the metal powder, it takes a lot of metal powder to make these. It's about, I think it's about 2 kilos of aluminium in here. So it weighs quite a lot, and it's also cold to the touch. So it's temperature conductive. So this one, my workshop's 18 degrees at the moment, but this box still feels quite cool to the touch because the metal has, you know, it's aluminium, it's metal. So it doesn't conduct, or it doesn't change its temperature that quickly. So it stayed quite cool. So these are, they start around £700 for these boxes generally because of the amount of time it takes to make each of them, and especially the aluminium ones, the amount of metal powder that goes into them. And buying the powder is exceptionally expensive. So that's those. Right. So before, yep.
What's your favorite timber to work with?
Okay, so I think my favorite timber has to be elm, and in particular burr elm. So, which is pertinent timing because I happen to have a piece of burr elm in front of me. I'll lift it up to show you in a moment. So the reason why I particularly like burr elm is, first of all, it has fantastic colouring, but also it's incredibly nice to work with. So it's quite tactile, and it's something like an oak. Oak tends to be very hard and very brittle, and it's quite tough to actually work with it and to control it. And oak has a tendency to warp and cut quite a lot. I found burr elm though is incredibly forgiving. It finishes beautifully, so it's nice to work with. And when you are cutting and working with it, it tends to be very, very stable. So it doesn't tend to cut and move. So it's quite a reliable timber to actually work with. Before I start to explain a little bit about the process of making a box, are there any questions, any other questions on there at the moment?
Yes, so did you talk about the price range? And also, where did you get your inspiration from?
Okay, so in terms of price range, so I mean, I have a selection of trinket boxes. So I make some very, very small, I don't have any in here at the moment, very small trinkety boxes, which start from around £80. They're just like a single tray, quite small single tray, just for keeping your little bits and pieces in. They start at £80. You then go through a range of trinket box sizes up to roughly A5 size, which are about £180 at max. Then we start to step into the desk boxes, which are 300 to 500. Stacking trinket boxes then, which I just showed with the aluminium and the burr oak, they start around 700. And then we move into the larger, more complex jewelry boxes with the trays, etc. in, and they start around 900 up to about 1800. And then humidors start around 1500, and they can go up and up. So I think that one at the back is 2500, and that's the most expensive box I have at the moment. And due to the amount of effort that's gone into it. So yeah, those are the costs. And in terms of the inspiration to make them, it really comes from the timber itself. So I have a slightly different approach to my design process for making boxes than a traditional cabinet maker. So a cabinet maker would get a piece of paper, draw out exactly what they want. So if it's a table, you know you want 4 legs and this is how they're going to look and this is the top. With boxes, and this is why I've got this piece in front of me, I really let the timber dictate exactly what I'm going to do. So I very rarely start with an exact size in mind. I want to make a box this size and it's going to look like this, so the sides need to be this deep. I tend to start with a piece of wood to try and understand how I can best utilize the figuring of the wood to create a piece. And that's really what's led to what I do, especially with the resin casting, is because I'm trying to keep and utilize all of the wood, because some of the best bits are at the edge, which are all wobbly and generally quite difficult to do anything with, but they're quite often the best bits. So my work has progressed by looking at how best to use the timber. Which bit do I want to show? Which type of a lid would that work for? How am I going to use this edge later if I cut it here? So just to explain, so hopefully you can see this. So this is a really nice piece of elm. It's a burr elm. It's the last one from the actual burr, and I know that because I bought all of the rest of them over the last couple of years. Now, when I look at this, and part of my design process will be to understand where's the nicest patch of burr. What you'll also see is there's a dirty grate hole here, which goes all the way through. So I know that part of my design is going to utilize this hole. So I will infill this with resin, depending on what. I'll probably use an aluminium resin combination to contrast nicely with the timber, because it's quite a dark timber. So I would then start to plot out, well, if this is going to be this is going to be infilled, I want to use this piece for my lid. So I'm going to make a desk box from this. So that's going to be my lid. And now I know where my lid is going to be. I know that I want this piece, where the crack is, to match the lid. So I know that I will cut along here, and this will be my sides. So the wood has really dictated what the size is going to be based on how you want to use the features within it. What that leaves then is a lot of wobbly edge, or Wainy edge as it's called, but you get all of this nice wobbly bit at the end. And what I would plan to do, and you probably can't see the yellow line, so I don't know why I'm bothering, but there you go. I would cut off this piece. So this, I can see already, has got a great edge and work really well when cast in resin to create a stacking trinket box, or one of the larger boxes where the wood is encased in resin and it wraps around the box. So that's how I work out what my box is going to be, which makes it an interesting challenge when I do get commissions and people say I want a specific box in a specific timber or a specific size, because unfortunately what that could result in is, for example, having to cut out part of the nicest piece of wood to get the exact size. So there's always that internal conflict when working to commission of how to best use the wood while satisfying the customer's requirements. So it can be quite a challenge. Sometimes it's a bit of a shame because things get lost and wasted, but that's part of life, and that's part of the creative process. Sometimes you have to work out how to use it, or how to meet a design requirement. So that's a little bit about the wood. I might as well talk now, before I explain how the boxes are made, about my timber and where it comes from. So unless there's any questions that people have, I think I'm trying to see.
Jonathan, yes, actually one of the questions was that where do you get your timber from, and which is your favorite timber to work with?
Okay, yeah, so this elm is definitely my favorite timber to work with. Now, in terms of where I source my timber, because everyone wants to know, and some people are because they're woodworkers and want to find your secret stash, and some people are genuinely interested just to understand, where does all of this stuff come from? So, as I said, I only work with British timbers. So for the last 4 years, every box I make has been made from British timbers. I have the exception being the humidors, where I use a Bolivian cedar. So it's all British timber. Now, a lot of it, for example, this piece of elm came from a tree surgeon. So there are a few tree surgeons out there who really know what they're doing. And when they are working in residential or on country estates, for example, and they have to do maintenance, if they're chopping down a tree, they will, if they spot an interesting occlusion, like an interesting burr, they will slice it up and they will dry it out. Now, I found quite a few of them, in case people want to go and buy some wood, on eBay. So actually, eBay is quite a good source for tree surgeons who cut down wood. Quite often you end up buying it and it's not quite dry. So it takes 2 years per inch of thickness for the timber to be dry enough to do anything with. And it can take further 2 to 3 years before it's ready to be turned into a box. So I know this piece in particular is about 4 years old, or it's been drying for at least 4 years. It's been in my workshop about a year already. So this is basically ready to go. I have other pieces which have been in there for about 4 years because they were too moist when I bought them. So that they will sit and they will wait until they've dried out and they're stable enough to use. Yeah, so there are a few other very good timber suppliers around the UK. So a lot of my horse chestnut came from a company in North Yorkshire called British Hardwoods. And despite the name, the vast majority of their business is based on not British hardwoods, but imported hardwoods from the US, and they make flooring, etc. But the owner of the business is a big fan of British timbers, like myself, and they have basically a warehouse area where they go out and they buy individual trees from estates, slice them up, dry them for cabinet makers and box makers like myself to go and pick from. And there's a few in the south. So there's a company called Vaston Timber who support the UK timber industry in a similar way. And the reason, I guess, why I think British timbers why it's so nice to be able to use them and why it's so important is there's a whole economy then which we're supporting within the UK. So for example, buying from a tree surgeon, this is supplementing his income to be able to carry on maintaining our woodlands. And similarly, when you're buying timber through companies, they're coming from managed woodlands. And if people don't buy the woods through these organizations, then there's no money left to manage the woodlands, and suddenly we'll start to lose the woodland, our woodlands, and they won't be so well maintained. Obviously, there's a huge benefit in terms of its mileage that it has to travel. So there's some lovely American timbers, but if they're having to be shipped over in a boat, you think about the environmental impact of cutting down a piece of timber on the west coast of the US, shipping or driving it all the way across the US before putting it on a boat to drive it to the UK for processing. It's traveled a huge amount, and there's just such a fabulous selection of UK timbers we could be using instead. So that's why I really like working with British timbers and why I think it's so important to. And I will mention now there's an organisation called Woodland Heritage, who are a charitable organisation who share my passion, and they are basically focused on educating people around British woodlands and woodland management, and how, especially for woodland owners, to actually make their woodlands work for them. So through forest management, planking or milling, and selling the timber as part of their woodland management. So there you go. That's part of it.
Jonathan, are you going to show us some of the demonstration about the wood?
Yes, I was just looking at a few of the questions.
We can at the end also. That's not a problem, because there are a couple of questions which I'm making notes. I think cool. We'll see how you do it.
Talk through. Let me pop this down. I'm going to be coming forward to and fro a little bit at the moment, just so you know. So I'm going to explain the process in making these stacking trinket boxes. So I'll leave this here as a little reminder. So they all start with a wobbly bit of wood, basically. So this is the edge of a plank of, this is a U. So the main section of the wood was actually used to make the jewelry box that I showed earlier. So this is actually part of the edge of it. Now it's not long enough to do anything really useful with. So what you'll see is this isn't quite long enough to make all four sides of the box. So what I'm going to do, I will cast this in some resin. So the first step is to make a mold to do your casting in. So I have my mold and my piece of wood will go in it. And what I will then do is I will use a 2-part epoxy resin. It's a special casting quality, which means you don't get too many bubbles in it. So you mix the 2-part resin together and then you add your components. So you add, for example, aluminium, or I use quite a lot of graphite powder or milled carbon fiber. And I use these additives to stabilize the resin, because resin is essentially, it's more like a plastic once it's set, and it's on its own, it's quite temperature sensitive, so it tends to expand and contract quite quickly, or can do, whereas wood is not temperature sensitive until it catches fire, obviously, but it is moisture sensitive, so wood will expand and contract with moisture. So the reason why I have the additives like the aluminium or the graphite powder is it stabilizes the resin, which means it will move roughly at the same pace as the wood. Otherwise, the whole thing will just separate and fall apart. So the mold, hopefully you'll have noticed, is not a particularly sophisticated mold. So if anyone's worked in the aerospace industry or has an interest in cars and custom car manufacture, they have incredibly accurate, well-defined molds which are polished to an incredible sheen. Mine's actually just a few bits of plywood wrapped in parcel tape, because epoxy resin doesn't stick to parcel tape. And there's actually no need for it to be any more sophisticated than that for my purpose, because I'm just going to plop a load of resin in and leave it to cure. So it takes 48 hours for the resin to cure hard enough to come out of the mold. Once it comes out of the mold, it then takes a further 7 days at least before it's cured enough to start working with. So once we've done that, we move on to our next step. So, here we go. So this is a piece of yew as well that's been cast. So this has been cast with, it's actually carbon fiber, milled carbon fiber. So it gives a slightly grayer finish than graphite. And what you can see is it's about 2 centimeters thick at the moment. So we have a plank, we've created a piece of resin timber hybrid, which is approximately 2 centimeters thick. Now, in order to make this into a box, the next step is to cut it in half. Now, and that means cutting down the thin edge all the way through to create 2 separate leaves of timber. So we do that on the bandsaw, and the reason why we do that is then we end up, and I'll come around to show you this. It's like Blue Peter. Here's one I prepared earlier. So here's a piece of wood which I've sawn through the middle. And the reason we do that, when we open it up, what you'll see is we have a mirror image, basically. So this is, it's quite a technique that basically every cabinet maker will use, and it's called buck matching. And the reason why we use it, or why it's used, is when you want to make a box, what it means is when the corners join, the grain matches perfectly on this corner, and then if we swap it round, we end up with a perfect match on that corner. And what it means, and why that's it's just about, creates a much more finished look, or a much better look. So if you look at this box, for example, you'll see the grain starts down here and it runs round, keeps going round, and then it joins up in the same point again. So it just means you end up with a box where there is no obvious seam, there's no obvious joint to the wood, or no obvious point where you've taken a long plank of wood and cut it to length, basically. And it just creates a much more finished look. So that's once we've resawn. It's called resawing, that cutting along the length of the wood. Once that's done, and it's basically then prepared to the finished thickness, and it's then left again for a few more days to make sure it settles again, because what happens as you cut through that thickness of timber, the resin gets very, very hot. So it's not great for your saw blades, but the resin gets very, very hot, and it actually becomes a little bit softer again. So it changes from a very hard state to a slightly soft state. And if you try and process it too quickly, it will actually start wobbling around, and you'll end up with not a very good joint. So everything requires a little bit of patience to make sure that you don't overheat the wood that you're working with, otherwise it will just basically melt and wobble in front of your eyes. So we've now got our 2 pieces of timber. And next step, it won't take too much longer on this, I don't think, is to cut it into strips. So this was a similar piece to this, and basically we need to cut them into small strips like this, and each of them will then, when it stacks together, I'll try to drop it, we then have, so these are going to be the sides of each of our stacking trays. So once they are prepared, we need to make sure that the top and the bottom are perfectly parallel, and that the 2 ends are also perfectly parallel and square to each other. If they're not, when we then start measuring and cutting and then assemble it, the box will have a skew to it, and then it won't sit properly, and it takes forever to try and rectify it. So a lot of time and effort goes into ensuring that the timber prepared is square, parallel, flat, because the actual joinery itself, especially for these boxes, is relatively simple. It's called a mitre joint, and I will show you what that means. So these are going to form one of my lids, and it's called a mitre joint because each piece has been cut, well, let's see, there you go, at a 45-degree angle, so that when they come together, the 2 mitres join and you end up with a nice crisp edge. Now, I really like using the mitre joints, especially with resin casting, because it allows that grain to flow all the way around. Obviously, there's lots of other joints you could use. You could use a dovetail or a mortise and tenon type joint. But for me, I think, especially for smaller boxes, these mitre joints create a really nice, slick, finished corner. So, last little step of the process. So I was actually going to get some tools out, but I probably won't now because I realise time is getting on. Once we've cut all of our mitres, we can then basically we glue the box together. Now this one's got the leather already, the base is already lined in leather, and it's a little bit of a different approach to this one because it's always nice to keep trying new things. Whereas these boxes, the base of the tray sits inside the tray below, and that's what keeps it stacked and together. I decided to try something different where there is no rebates. So this one in particular, it has a lining inside it. So you have your normal box, and then you basically create another box within the box, and that lip will sit into the bottom of the tray above. So and I have to make sure I get it the right way around, otherwise it doesn't match. And what you then end up around is what you can see. You then end up with a shadow gap. Now this one's a little bit big at the moment, so I'll be doing some work to finish the lining, but the liner, the inside liner, is sitting inside the base of the tray above, and that will keep it there and keep it stacked and keep it all square and flush and looking like it should do. So this one will be lined again, the top tray, and then the lid will sit on top of it in the same fashion. So those are the steps basically in making one of these stacking trinket boxes. Obviously you then can start to define what each tray will look like. So there's then the dividers to be made, and they can be defined, you know, as many as you want, as big as you want, as small as you want, etc. So that is, I realise it's not the most interactive demonstration, but woodworking tends to be very noisy and dusty, so it's not the ideal thing to demonstrate in a live environment. I think there are quite a few questions. Piyush, I don't know if you want to kind of go through a few of them.
Sure.
Have
you finished the process?
Yeah, so that's kind of it. I mean, once we get to this point, it's a case of sanding, waxing, sanding, oiling, waxing, and then lining with, well, I use sheep suede or goat suede, typically, or a cotton suede.
Sure. Okay. So the question somebody has asked, do you have issues with keeping dust, etc., out of your aluminum resin casting? You're frozen now, Jonathan. I think we might have lost Jonathan. I don't know. I'll just check.
Oh.
Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me? I think it'd be you, Piyush. Can anybody? Let's see. Can anyone?
Jonathan, okay, I'll ask you another question. I'll see whether we can hear you or not. So yes, the question was, do you have issues with keeping dust out of your aluminum resin casting?
Okay, so when I mean, I keep my workshop quite dust-free as much as I can as a woodworker. And I've invested a lot of money on dust extraction. So I have a large dust extractor for my bigger tools and a smaller one for my handheld tools. So I try to keep dust to a minimum. Now, when I do my casting, obviously, aluminium powder and the additives to the resin is pretty nasty stuff. So obviously you have to wear a face mask and goggles and gloves to make sure you don't get it on you. Once it's actually been cast, I then actually wrap everything in black shrink wrap. So I just pop it over the top, just anything in on top.
Jonathan, we're losing you. Your
2 seconds.
Tell your wife, stop live streaming. You're working. I hope you guys can hear me. Jonathan, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now, Piyush?
Yes, we can hear you now. So I'm going to go away again and we'll start the questions again. Yeah.
So sorry, I've had to switch to my phone. So I'm just going to plug you in there. Okay. So hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah. So I was saying with the resin casting and to prevent dust getting into it, it's actually, you know, I cover things with with shrink wrap, once I've cast it or once I've poured it to stop dust too much or any big bits of dust getting in. To be honest, the way I work, and I know resin casting for especially jewelers is, you know, a real problem because it can sink in. Once you add aluminium and you add an awful lot at quite a high ratio, it becomes very thick. So it's quite hard for dust to penetrate beyond the very top surface. And when I've done my casting, and let me show you. It doesn't come out of the mold like this. It doesn't come out smooth and flat. So once it's been cast, it's actually incredibly rough and lumpy. And I then plane and finish it. So I actually flatten it off to get rid of probably the top few millimeters and the bottom few millimeters of the timber to make sure it's got no marks or dust or ridges, etc. in it. So it's not a huge issue for me, but yes, I try to minimize the dust in the workshop from a health perspective mainly. I think there was a question about how do I carve my lids as well. I think I saw someone ask that. So I will quickly show you the tool of choice. So when it comes to shaping the lids and creating that curve and for the finger, I use an angle grinder, which is quite an aggressive tool, but I have a couple of attachments for it as well. So these are made by a company called Arbortech, if anyone wants to get into wood carving. And basically it's like a small chainsaw wheel, which you attach to your angle grinder. It spins incredibly quickly and just cuts chunks of wood out and sends them flying all over the workshop at great speed. So you need to make sure if you're using one that you have thick gloves, something over your neck and a face mask on, because as I discovered, it sends sharp chippings out at quite a speed and you can get them lodged into your skin quite easily. I also have another one of their tools, which is a turbo plane. Same idea, it just leaves a slightly better finish. But these are what I use for carving my lids for both the concave and the convex side underneath. Okay. Were there other questions, Priyash?
Yes, there are a couple of questions which I'll take, and then we can wrap it up. So did you answer that? Did you invent the resin and wood process, or how did you learn to do that process? Because that's quite unique.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the idea of combining the Wainy edge of the timber with resin has been, I mean, people have been doing it for a little while now. If you look on YouTube, people are making what's called resin river tables. So because when you have your two pieces of wood and you cast your resin in between, it looks like a river. The majority of people seem to make tables and only tables. So when I saw it, I realized this is a great opportunity to utilize the Wainy edge timber and to preserve it and to use it for box making. So whilst I didn't come up with the idea of casting resin, casting wood in a piece of resin to use it, I'm certainly one of the people who's certainly pushing it as far as they can along how to use wood and resin casting whilst box making. Because I mean, people have always been using it to fill small holes and knots, etc. But to actually incorporate it in such an extreme way is definitely my thing. And I think that's what I'm probably most known for now at the moment anyway.
Okay.
Any last question?
Yes, I have a very good question. But before that, a serious question. What do you line the boxes with? Because some people couldn't hear you. So
okay, sorry. So I line my boxes depending on what they will be used for. So if it's a jewelry box, I'll tend to use a cotton suede. For desk boxes and certainly some of the trinket boxes, I use sheep or goat suede. So there's a company down south somewhere called Pittard's Leather, and so it's dressmaking suede basically. So it's very thin, very fine, and very soft, and it gives a lovely feel to it basically inside the box lining.
And can people choose the color of the lining, or you provide the lining color?
So I always line my boxes before I take them anywhere to sell or before I put them online, because otherwise they tend to look a bit rubbish. So I always line them, and I always end up choosing or trying to choose a color which will contrast quite nicely with the resin or the timber. But yeah, people then are quite often ask, could you reline it? I'd really like it in this color. And then they can pick the color lining they want and they can be relined. And that's absolutely just part of the joy of doing it. It's a bit of a fiddly job getting the old lining out, but it's just part of the service, isn't it?
Sure. And Jonathan, I think I'll take one more question, and then if you can give a small tour about your workshop, that would be great. But before you do that, can you just make your phone in the landscape format? Right now, it's in the portrait format, and then so maybe yes, that works well.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so now I have a question. Do you support your family with your work, or does your family support you with your work?
So my family are very supportive of me, and I mean my girlfriend has always been very encouraging of what I do. Financially, we are very independent, so I mean we have always been that way, which is you bring your bit to the table, I'll bring my bit to the table. But in terms of their emotional support with like helping me out at fairs, especially, so Kim, my partner, is likes coming to the fairs and meeting people and interacting with them as well. So, and my son's very keen to get in the workshop and bang some nails into some nice bits of hardwood. So they are incredibly supportive of what I do. Absolutely, and they always have been, which is encouraging. Otherwise, they'd hate the fact that I'm out in the workshop late at night banging away when I should be inside helping out.
Great. Please give us a tour, and then I can just
Sure.
telling you where your stuff sells.
Sure. So I'll try not to move around too much. So just to explain a little bit about my workshop setup. So it's quite a small workshop. It's basically 5 meters long by 5 meters wide. So it's 25 square meters, which is not an awful lot of space to fit in a woodworking workshop. Everyone always likes looking at everyone else's tools. So can you see them? So just this side of the camera is where I keep all of my clamps. And then as we go around the workshop, we have the bandsaw, which is like the real powerhouse of the woodworking workshop. That's what we use for, well, I use it for most cutting activities. So, but it's particularly useful for resawing. So when we're sawing down the thickness of a timber, you can see, obviously I have to keep a child's biking here because that's clearly critical to my woodworking. We then have my dust extractor, and behind that there is a small pillar drill which I use for drilling the hinges for drilling the holes for my hinges. As we move around, where are we up to? There. So what we have then is basically all of my timber is kept at the back of the workshop, and it's all kept horizontally. Vertically, sorry, not horizontally. So it's kept up on end, basically. So you can store it flat, try and stop it cupping and warping, but I keep my timber in quite thick sections, so it's not going to start warping and cupping, and it means I can get into it a little bit easier. In terms of tools then and the setup that I have basically a drum sander, which I use for those of you into the technical things. Once I've planed timber to thickness, I then use the drum sander to do the final finishing. And in fact, I use that quite often for thicknessing on burrs, because burr timber has a terrible habit of tearing out and falling into chunks. So the drum sander is a much gentler way of doing it, and it tends not to ruin the wood. We have a small hobby size table saw. It's tiny for a cabinet maker, but it's actually the perfect size for box making. It's accurate enough as well. That's only ever used for cutting miters. I don't use it for ripping or anything else. And then we have the router table, which is again, between the router table and the bandsaw are probably the two most useful tools I have in the workshop. And then at the front, which you saw me, I have my workbench where basically everything gets assembled. I do any of my hand tool working here, so cutting or shooting planes and planing basically by hand goes on here. And then the last one, the reason why it works so well having such a small workshop is on this side of my workshop, it's all storage. So it's all built in cupboards. So this one. So without masses of storage, so all of my handheld power tools are kept in there. I probably anally retentively well organized because I just have to be that way. So I know people say, oh, well, do you know which is in which cupboard, etc. I know exactly where all of my tools are because it would drive me mad if I couldn't find what I needed when I needed it. So having masses of cupboard space to keep everything in and keep it organized means there's more space in the small workshop to actually move around safely and to have the tools that I really need out, ready to be used. So that's my workshop tour. If anyone has any questions on that, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And yes, it is clean and tidy. I haven't even swept today, though. That's how clean I keep it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think it was quite entertaining. I really loved what you showed, and very clean workshop, I must say that as well. Even my house is not that clean. Thank you all for watching. Next week, I would be talking with Dan Good, discussing the ways how to remain visible in the industry and to get connected with the customers, because as we all know that the craft industry has been severely impacted, and so we are trying to find ways to get connected to the customers, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.